Well, good afternoon. Tonight we're going to talk about investment crowdfunding and how it's going to affect venture capital over the next 5 years or so. So first, I'm the CEO and founder of Wefunder, and we help investors around the world invest as little as $1,000 in some highly curated startups right now in the United States. Some quick stats: we have about 45,000 users. About 30% are international across the globe. And collectively, they've invested about $13 million in 110 startups over the past couple of years. So far, our biggest win is a company called Zenefits. 2 years ago, the investors on our platform invested in them at a $10 million valuation. And right now, they're valued at about $4.5 billion, 300x or so unrealized return. To make that more concrete, one of our investors invested $10,000 2 years ago, and now it's worth about $3 million. So he's pretty happy. So right now, the current state of the industry is that there's dozens of crowdfunding platforms around the world, but only 3 that really matter. And those are AngelList, Funders Club, and Wefunder. And the reason for that is that these 3 companies did all of the work necessary to make sure there's no downside risk for the startup founder to accept crowdfunded money. That is, they solved the problem of adverse selection. And they did this in multiple ways, but one of the more important ways is all these platforms will actually create a single-purpose vehicle, and all the investors around the world will pool their funds into that one fund, which then makes one investment into the startup. So from the founder's perspective, we just act as one large angel investor that typically delivers between $200,000 and $500,000 in a week or two. And if we didn't do it this way, with one fund, no startup founder would work with us. And right now, crowdfunding is kind of best used just to top off your round. Typically, they'd raise about $1 million in face-to-face meetings with investors, and then reserve the last 30 or 40% for a crowdfunding platform, which can top it off in a week or two. Just makes things a little faster and easier for them. So right now, I would say this is actually not very innovative. There's some benefits, like people around the world now actually get access to great companies that a few years ago they would not have been able to. And it also helps that the minimum investment to get started is only $1,000, where a few years ago, it would cost at least $100,000 to be an LP of some small venture capital firm to get access to these kind of companies. But there's some things that are holding this industry back. And the 3 biggest is, first, for all of those funds we organize to invest in the company, there's a limit of only 99 investors that can invest. Second, we generally can't advertise. It's kind of like trying to grow an e-commerce site, but you have to hide the buy button unless you're a logged-in user. It's kind of difficult. And finally, and most importantly, you need to be, under US law, an accredited investor in order to invest in startups. This means you either have $1 million or more in net worth, or you make $200,000 or more a year in income. So basically excluding most of humanity. Now in the future, all these limitations are going away. So I founded Wefunder 3 years ago because I wanted anybody, no matter how wealthy they are, to be able to invest even as little as $100 in startups. In startups they believe in, that their friends founded, or that they love. And that's why I built this company, and that's why it's exciting to me. So 3 years ago, we launched this petition to help the government change the law to allow anybody to be able to invest. And it got a fair amount of press, and we were invited to go down to Washington, D.C., where we met a couple of senators, a congressman, and the president's office. And in a small way, we helped broker a compromise. And amazingly enough, this law was passed, and we were invited to watch President Obama actually sign it into law. And this basically happened only in 3 months from passing Congress, which is an amazing, unheard of speed. But unfortunately, we're still actually waiting for this law to be rolled out 3 years later. The way it works in the US is Congress writes like 30 pages of legislation, and then some government agency, in this case the SEC, then takes that and writes like 600 pages of rules with all the details. And they still haven't done that 3 years later. But it's getting out there pretty soon. So to give a few predictions for next year, one, finally, normal people who aren't wealthy will be able to invest very small amounts into startups. And when it first starts, it'll probably primarily be used by small businesses and very, very early stage seed rounds under $100,000. Because the law, when it first comes out, is like the first draft. It's not quite perfect yet. There's going to be a few problems that are going to cause some adverse selection, where some companies with other funding options won't want to use it just right now. But with one very, very big exception. The reason it's kind of complicated, but there's basically another law that's being rolled out that's going to be good for very late stage companies. Think like Uber or Airbnb, which will let them actually crowdfund before their IPO. So for instance, you can imagine Airbnb crowdfunding and letting their hosts be able to purchase some pre-IPO stock, mostly as a way to reward them for being users. And we just see something like this happen next year. On the accredited side, we're going to see the 99 limit fall away, which means that platforms will start leading more Series A rounds. And this happens a little bit right now. Like for Wefunder, we raised $4 million through our own platform from our own users. Basically, our users are our only investors. But this will happen more and more with other companies starting next year. Now, after that, I'm going to take a step back and look at things from a broader level. Right now, we're all used to basically two different kinds of markets. There's private markets and public markets. Now, private companies are generally understood to be more risky, and so most countries have laws that require you to be wealthy or meet some measure of sophistication to invest in them. And for public companies, there's generally a political consensus that these companies are just not allowed to fail overnight. The theme is Enron must never happen again. And so because of that, governments are putting more and more regulations and rules, which makes it very burdensome to be a public company. And so most startups now delay it as long as possible. But what we're seeing is this new category emerge, kind of a public-private hybrid, where these companies are generally understood to be risky, like startups, and have less government oversight, but you can invest a very small amount of your income into them. And this is where crowdfunding is fitting in. And this is probably going to take like 3 or 4 years at least for all the laws and regulations to catch up. But it's pretty bipartisan on both sides for this to happen. In the United States, for instance, Republicans are generally in favor of anything that can deliver more capital to businesses. And for Democrats, this is really about kind of a wealth inequality issue. They've built a system, so there's so much red tape and regulations on public companies that it takes now 9 or 10 years for a company to go public, where 20 years ago, Netscape did it 1 year after being founded. But that means that all this great wealth creation is really only available to the wealthy. Only the wealthy can actually get all those returns before it actually goes public and starts growing slower. All right, so I'll conclude with some thoughts on how this is all going to affect venture capital over the next few years. So first, what's going to happen when crowdfunding platforms can reliably deliver $5 million in 24 hours? Well, most obviously that venture capitalists, as we know them today, will be pushed off into leading Series B rounds, and they'll have less risk and also make less returns. The next question I would ask is, how can more moonshots be funded? Right now, especially in Silicon Valley, venture capital is mostly about kind of like a unicorn race. There is so much money, an absurd amount of money, being funneled into software startups that can conceivably be worth $1 billion in a few years. And that's great, and that should continue happening, but there's a lot more things that are worthy of funding that might take a bit longer, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years. And crowdfunding is going to help fill that gap. Just as one extreme example, Elon Musk has said that he won't take SpaceX public because he doesn't think the public markets will support his quest to go to Mars. But as for me, I would love to invest in SpaceX. And I would love that Elon Musk actually has the balls to actually want to go to Mars. But to me, that's great. The next question I would ask is, what happens when we train more founders? And the best way to train founders is to give them some money to go start a business. Right now, the conventional wisdom is that venture capital can't scale. But that's only true because there's a limited number of founders who have the experience to go on to create great companies. And usually they don't do it the first time. Usually it's their second or third or fourth company. But what crowdfunding can do is let companies be funded who, for the first company, might be not quite as ambitious. Maybe they only want to build a $10 million company in Turkey. But when that entrepreneur sells that company and creates a second or third or fourth, then the odds of him creating something that's truly impactful increase, and then venture capital will scale. And likewise, what happens when we train more investors? And I think this is going to have the biggest impact in the emerging markets. Right now, we're already training thousands of international investors how investing in startups is different than investing in real estate. And hopefully they'll go back to their countries and invest in their own country, companies in their own countries. And finally, I would ask, what happens if 30 world-class artificial intelligence experts basically join forces and band together to create their own distributed venture capital fund and do it just in a few clicks of a button? I personally would like to invest in really deep domain experts who are on the ground, rather than only invest in some venture capital firm on Sand Hill Valley, the Sand Hill Road, which might not be quite have that domain expertise. So if there's one theme of this presentation, it's that we're all going to be VCs, literally. We all can invest our own money, soon as low as $100. But we're also going to be able to help invest other people's money, and through contributing our expertise and experiences, be able to get a small sliver of the carried interest profits. But most importantly, we're all going to be able to help and nurture more startups. Not just because it's a good thing to do and because it's good for our society, but because in a small way, it's going to be all of our jobs. Thank you.